All right, so we do want to tackle validation, but before we get there, let's take a short break and talk about a couple other things to clean up our code. And this will give us some good examples to discuss Carbon a bit more. We can talk about query scopes and a number of little things like that. Okay, so back to articles controller. Here's where we left off, and we can actually improve this. Right now, we were just setting the published at field to the current time. And that's just because we didn't want to bother with the date. However, that's not real world, of course. So why don't we fix that? And in the process, you'll get to see some cool things related to Eloquent. Okay, so I'm going to remove that entirely. And hopefully I can just say inline this, like so. A lot cleaner, right? Next, we need to go to our view. Because remember, if we switch back, we have no published at field here. So in real life, you'd probably use some kind of dedicated JavaScript calendar, right? But in our case, why don't we just fall back to a simple HTML5 date input? So let's do this. We'll have a text field, and this will be for published at, but we'll change this to publish on. And next, it shouldn't be a text field. It should be a date, but I don't think Laravel offers that. So instead, we're going to use a generic input method. And that way I can specify the type of the input. In this case, date. Okay, so let's just leave it like that and see what we get in the browser. So we run it, and there we go. And luckily, because we're using a modern browser, it'll force a format here. Okay, next, what I'm thinking is it would be nice if this would default to today. That way I don't always have to manually enter this. That's a pain. So let's do that. I'm going to switch back. And right here, the third argument, that will always be the default. But now remember, you can't just enter anything. It has to be in the right format. So it needs to be a date. So we switch back. And yes, you could use Carbon if you want, like this, format, year, month, day. But in this case, we don't really need it. We can just use the simple PHP date function, like so. Okay, let's switch back, refresh, and now we have a default that you can adjust when you need to. Great. But now let's try something out. Let's just say gibberish here, gibberish body, and the publish on will be January 30th. So if I run that, yes, it seems to have worked. But let's inspect this. SQLite storage, database.sqlite, select star from articles, and here it is. So yes, it was set to January 30th, but it would be nice if we actually had the current time as well. That way, behind the scenes, we could know, all right, this article was published on January 30th at 4:23, right? In its current state, we don't know that. So why don't we fix that? And I'll show you some cool things along the way. I'm now going to switch over to my article Eloquent model, and you're going to learn about accessors and mutators. This gives us a way to manipulate data before it's inserted into the database or after it's retrieved. So for example, with a mutator, I could say, create a method called set published at attribute. Now notice this convention, it's very important. We have the word set followed by the field name. So if we're trying to manipulate a name column, we would have set, name, and then the word attribute. That is the convention there. So if we want to set an address, set address attribute. And notice in these situations where you could have an underscore, just convert that to camel case. Okay, so now we can say, when you're setting the publish at attribute, I want to make sure it's in the correct format. So we can set the attributes directly, published at equals, and then why don't we use Carbon here? So we import that, and then we can say create from format, which will be year, month, day. And then we will pass the string date as the second argument. And that's it. So now we've parsed it correctly, and the time will be added on as well, if that makes sense for your project. All right, so let's try this out again. We're going to create a new article, some more gibberish here, and the published on will be January 28th. Okay, so now if we select star again, you'll see that we did set it. However, here's something to consider. If we set it in the future, then you might just want to say January 28th at midnight is when it should go up. And if that's the case, well, we don't really want to do it like this. Instead, you could always do something like Carbon parse date to try to figure it out. Now, if we were to backtrack, third attempt, and we run this again, take a look at the difference. Now we run it, and it will set it to January 28th, but we don't have a time, so that will set it to midnight essentially. Okay, so this is starting to look good. However, we have a problem now. If I refresh, I'm seeing articles that are set to be published in the future. For example, any of these right here. Those should not display here because they're set to publish in a couple days or so. So we need to make sure that we have some kind of query scope to limit that. Here's how we do that. I'll first show you directly in the controller, and then we'll clean things up a bit by moving it to our Eloquent model. So right up here at the top, we're saying articles, order them by published at in descending order, and then get everything. Well, we don't exactly want that. We really want to say limit them to where the published at field is less than or equal to, well, now. So we can do carbon now. Okay, so now if we switch back and we give this a refresh, notice that we're not displaying any of those because we've adjusted it. Get all articles, order them by published at in descending order, but only get the articles where that column, its time, is less than or equal to now. So anything that's in the future or greater than will of course be excluded. And then we get the results of that query. But now you can see this starts to get messy, especially when you can imagine situations where you would use this sort of query in multiple parts of your application. It's a shame that we have to write this really long line of code for something that's sort of integral for our application. And that's where query scopes can come into play. We can basically take a query and add a clause to it directly on the Eloquent model. Or in other words, what would be a nice way to represent this? We want the latest articles, but I also want the ones that have been published. That makes sense, right? So maybe I could write published here, and that looks a little cleaner, right? Okay, let's make that work. I want a scope called published. So we will switch back to our model, and we'll add a new query scope right here. Now the convention for this is the word scope followed by the name. We called ours published, and that will accept our query builder. So now we can basically paste in what we had before, like so. Query where the published at is less than or equal to carbon now. All right, you've added your first scope. If we come back and give it a refresh, it should still work, and it does. But now the benefit is you can use this anywhere in your application. Or what if you wanted to do the inverse? You needed some way for your app to fetch all articles that are set to be published. That might be cool for an admin panel, right? Well, why don't we say scope unpublished? And the only difference would be get the articles where the published at date is greater than now. Okay, let's check that out, and we're going to fake it and just do it right here. Now, we only want to fetch the unpublished articles. So if we refresh, it works. Easiest thing in the world. Okay, so we're just about done for this lesson. I want to show you one more thing though. Imagine that when we view an article, we may need to do something with the date at some point. So let's do this. Let's die and dump the articles published at date and see what that looks like. Okay, give it a refresh. Let's take a look at that one. And yes, we get the full timestamp. But it would be nice if that was a Carbon instance, because here's something cool. Take a look at created at. These are very special fields that Laravel already knows about. And notice that it's smart enough to convert them to instances of Carbon. And again, if Carbon is completely new to you, we have a dedicated video on it at Laracast, so you can learn all about it there. But I'll show you a couple things you can do with that. You could do things as simple as, well, we have nice little property accessors. So if I want the year, it's very easy. Just do year, month, come back, refresh, or we can even manipulate it in a very readable way. For example, I want to add 8 days to it. Okay, now if we refresh, we've modified it to be 8 days from the published at time. Or you could even format it. So you could say format with year and the month is all you want. Let's see that. Refresh. And now that works. Or we could even format it as a readable way by using the diff for humans method. And this is really good for things like timelines. Imagine Twitter where you add a status and below it, it says this status was published 12 minutes ago. Well, you can use something like that to offer that right out of the box. So refresh, and it looks like we will publish this article in 5 days from now. So as you can imagine, it's really convenient if these times are automatically converted to instances of Carbon. But just to bring this back to published at, and real quick, by the way, the same will be true for updated at. But anyways, to bring it back to published at, well, we don't have any of those conveniences. We just have a string. So it would be cool if we could tell Laravel, well, I have this additional timestamp here, and I want you to treat this as a Carbon instance as well. Here's how we do that. We're going to switch back to article, and we're going to add this property, protected dates. Here, I'm going to set the name of the column, like so, and that's it. So now, if we switch back and refresh, we can see it's a Carbon instance, which means we have access to all of those methods and getters, like we did with the created at and updated at and deleted at columns. And if you're curious how that works, well, you can always research the model. Now, if we look at a method called getDates right here, you'll see that it takes our defaults, so it's still going to treat created at and updated at as timestamps, but it will merge those defaults with whatever we set as a dates property. So that's how we do that here. All right, so we're starting to make some good progress, right? In this lesson, you learned a little more about Carbon, you learned about query scopes, you learned about mutators, we learned how to take any kind of timestamp and have it treated as a Carbon instance. And if we switch back to articles controller, we've cleaned up our controller considerably. So now in the next video, we've waited long enough, we really need to tackle validation. I'll see you then.